Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you are watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. I have the wonderful privilege each week of leading conversations with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors, and this week is no exception. I'm pleased to have two Bible scholars from Dallas Theological Seminary on today's program, Dr. John Adair and Dr. Michael Svigel. My first guest is Dr. John Adair. Dr. Adair is an Associate Professor of Theological Studies. He earned his bachelor's degree from Criswell College, his Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and his Doctor of Philosophy also from Dallas Theological Seminary. Prior to joining the faculty of Dallas Theological Seminary, he was a writer for Insight for Living. Dr. Adair is the author of several journal articles and co-author of the book that we are going to discuss in today's podcast, and this series of podcasts entitled Urban Legends of Church History, 40 Common Misconceptions. Dr. Adair, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
And my second guest is Dr. Michael Svigel. Dr. Svigel is the Department Chair and Professor of Theological Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Svigel earned his bachelor's degree from Philadelphia Biblical University, now known as Cairn University,
Correct.
His Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and his Doctor of Philosophy, also from Dallas Theological Seminary. He has also written many journal articles and co-authored or authored and edited many different books, including a series on exploring Christian theology, a book entitled Retro Christianity, and most recently a book on the Shepherd of Hermas. And of course, the book we're discussing today, co-authored with Dr. Adair, Urban Legends of Church History, 40 Common Misconceptions. Dr. Svigel, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Well, Dr. Svigel, before we jump into the contents of your book, please tell us, our listeners, about the series of books of which this volume is a part.
Yeah, the series started with Urban Legends of the New Testament, and very quickly they kind of liked that theme that's B&H academic, so they listed several authors to do a couple more books. So far been released Urban Legends of the New Testament, Urban Legends of the Old Testament, Urban Legends of Church History, this one, and then Urban Legends of Theology. And whether they have more in the works or not, I'm not sure.
Well, I know it's been pretty well received, hasn't it?
It has been. It's a fun way of presenting sometimes topics that can be, arduous.
Sure. It makes me think of a little bit of Exegetical Fallacies by D.A. Carson, where you don't want cited in that book. And
exactly.
I know.
The thing is, I think even us in our early careers have probably been guilty of some of these,
Sure.
as you're learning.
Yeah. Of course, D.A. Carson, I think, would say that in his Exegetical Fallacies book as well.
You're always learning and growing, right?
Although I did notice he never cited his colleagues at Trinity. Only us and other seminaries that he doesn't have to walk past in the hallways. Right. Maybe that was coincidental. Well, in your introductory chapter, the two of you discussed that an urban legend is, and now I'm quoting you write, "We hear pastors preaching them from the pulpits. Teachers dispute them in their classrooms. The internet promotes them as unquestioned truth. Books, films, and TV shows retell them with intriguing plots, and well-meaning but ill-informed people believe them." You go on to write, "Much of the time, the problem is one of exaggeration. The urban legend is based on some historical fact or facts, but like a game of telephone, the tale has gotten taller and taller with the telling." Dr. Adair, would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, so what the book does is it takes 40 of these stories, right, that we've heard throughout our ministries, both in our teaching. Students will bring these up from time to time, but also in our churches and in reading that we've done over the years. And there are all kinds of different ones. There are occasions where there may be a nefarious actor who's out there trying to bring misinformation, but probably more often it's well-meaning people who just exaggerate the truth or get it half right. And we're just trying to bring a little clarity to that. Yeah.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate how well laid out your book is in a very clear, user-friendly, and straightforward manner. And you organize your book into 4 parts. Each part focuses on a period of time and you discuss the urban legends that developed during those time frames. So following your book's layout, let's discuss a few urban legends from the first section of your book, which is the early church, approximately you labeled AD 50 to AD 500. And one unfortunate urban legend is that the Bible was canonized by an emperor, i.e. Constantine oftentimes, or a pope or a church council. Dr. Svigel, please first explain what the canon is, and then tell us about the development of this urban legend regarding the canon of Scripture.
Sure. So the word canon means, in Greek, it means a standard or a rule. And there's a common misconception that a book of the Bible is regarded as canonical because it measures up to some outside standard, when in fact what it means is the book itself is the standard for what we believe, what we teach, what we should do, the final authority in all matters of faith and practice. That's accepting a book as canonical means it's the standard itself. And so where did we get these particular books, these 66 books? Where did they come from? And who decided which ones go between, the front and back cover of this? So people have thrown out different theories. Like you mentioned, the Emperor Constantine decreed this to be the list of books, this and no other, and threw out all other viable candidates, or some church council like Nicaea, or maybe some evil men trying to vie for power against people with other ideas. And whatever happened to these other books? So there's a lot of intrigue. Some people may remember the Da Vinci Code. That was that same theme. But you also hear it among sometimes Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox apologists who say, well, the church decided through its bishops or councils or whatever, which books should be in the Bible. So you'll trust the Bible, but you won't trust the church who chose the Bible. And they kind of use it as an apologetic to generate confidence in the church.
Right. So to shift some respect and authority to the church.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's interesting, we mentioned the Da Vinci Code. Of course, many of our students now don't remember book,
right?
But it was very popular, very influential. Family members of my own that grew up in a Bible preaching, Bible teaching church kind of accepted that theory because of the influence and effectiveness of popular writings, right?
Yeah, and he said right in the very beginning, everything in here is true, so it must be, right?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Certainly urban legend that was helped by the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Dr. Adair, please explain what really happened as it relates to the canon of Scripture.
Yeah, so unlike the Da Vinci Code, which of course has in it this great historian who's telling us all these things that are supposed to be true, and he does narrate a version of this story, the legend that Dr. Svigel was talking about. Unlike that, there really was no ecumenical council, and ecumenical just means worldwide, where everybody was invited to come to it. There was no ecumenical council that decided the canon. There was never a moment where the Emperor Constantine or some other Roman emperor said, you know what, these are going to be the books. And instead of that, what we have is a really interesting process that is much more organic and what I would describe as spirit-led than some kind of, small group of important, powerful people that are making a decision for things. And so really what we see is these books come into the church in the first generation. Apostles write books and they pass those books to churches, right? They write books for the church at Philippi or the church at Colossae, or they're writing a gospel. And those churches receive those books. And we even have evidence in the scriptures themselves of when they receive them, they're supposed to pass them on. I think in Colossians, Paul's talking about, he says, you need to pass this to the church at Laodicea and also get their letter that I wrote to them, So there's this expectation that Christians were going to share these books with one another. This is the way that the books came into the church. And so what we have is then over time, over that first generation into the second and into the third, a pattern of receiving books from apostles saying, oh, this is important, it's authoritative, because an apostle wrote it to us and is telling us what this is all about. And we're going to read it in our community together, and we're going to talk about it. So we have sermons and teachings and things like that. But also, we have this pattern of, now that I've received this book and I know it's authoritative, I want to share it with my sister church down the road. And so they will copy these things, or they'll pass it on, or however that would work in that particular context. So we're getting a growing canon of books where, we're the church at Colossae, but now we've somehow received this book Philippi as well, right? And now we have this. And what we know is by the end of the first century, it's very likely that Paul's letters were already traveling together, and the four Gospels were already seen as in the early second century. And so you're getting this developing canon, but it's all this very organic, spirit-led process. And only later By the time we get to really the 4th century, do we start to get councils, smaller councils, local councils mostly, that are
So not ecumenical.
not
councils.
ecumenical, just, a council at Rome or a synod at Hippo in North Africa, where they're saying, you know what, these are the books we're using. And they write those down. And by the end of the 4th century, we have a pretty consistent list of 27 New Testament books. And probably should say that what we're talking about here really is the New Testament, right? The Old Testament was pretty well established by the time we get to the 1st century. And so that's not really up for discussion.
And of course, Jesus even refers to the prophets and the law, right?
Right.
So a complete canon of the Hebrew Bible that they all regarded, even Jesus regarded as history. So
Exactly.
So it's really when these false gospels surface and other writings that we'll talk about here in a minute that led to the need for the council.
Yeah, you do start getting these books that are floating around. And, one of the early people who's making a list is a guy called Marcion in the 2nd century. And Marcion was from Rome. His list is very short. He doesn't like the Old Testament. He doesn't like most of the New Testament. He pretty much just likes Paul and a little bit of Luke. The earliest list of books that we have is called the Muratorian Canon. It comes from the church at Rome in the mid to late 2nd century, which is in stark contrast to Marcion. Yeah.
So there was apostolic authority in these books and they were being used regularly. And so like you said, it's not like they are identifying these as inspired and authoritative. They're already authoritative and inspired, and they're just recognizing that.
Yeah, it's not like we're getting to a point in history where we've collected all these books and we're like, okay, now let's decide which ones are apostolic. No. We know they're inspired because they've been handed down to us and we're using them.
And of course, again, Dan Brown's version was kind of these won over these, right? Two groups of Christians, and the Constantine's version won out over the
It's a battle of wills, it's all about power, right? And who has control over the canon has control over the church was the idea. I mean, it makes an intriguing Hollywood plot, but it's just not true.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Svigel, you also include in a section in this chapter entitled Mini Myths, which I appreciated some of these mini myths, sprinkled here and there, regarding the legend that dozens of gospels vied for inclusion in the New Testament canon. Would you please explain this myth?
Sure, and this is, again, something that was popularized by the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code. But it's also out there in a lot of popular level books on, where did we get the Bible and why not these other books? And these other books are things like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Thomas, people have heard of, Gospel of Judas even. The problem with these things are yes, they exist. You can go online and find them and read them, but they were all written much later. The 4 Gospels we have come from the 1st century, written by eyewitnesses, close associates. These are all fake. They weren't written by Mary, Philip, Thomas, etc. They're people later who have different theologies, bad theologies against the true church, writing books they wish recorded things Jesus said and did. But it's propaganda. We call them pseudepigraphic. They're written by people and then falsely attributed to actual apostles. So they've never, ever, by any Orthodox Christians, been accepted as canonical.
Very good. And I appreciate the documentation you do in your book and the resources that your readers can go to for further depth. And of course, you cite Michael Kruger in this chapter, who's president of Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, I believe, campus. But actually, in my Gospels course, I just include a link to a discussion he has on these Gnostic Gospels for my students to go further and just to get a good understanding of why they're not included.
Right.
We don't always have time in all of our classes to develop that in greater depth. Anyhow, so Michael Kruger has a couple good resources on that subject and good posts out there if anybody's out there interested in learning more about that.
Yep.
Great.
In just a moment, we'll return to our interview, but first, our mission moment of the week. As many of you know, I recently returned from a teaching trip to Alexandria, Egypt, where I had the privilege of teaching 20 Arabic-speaking students. I'd love you to hear from Samuel. Please join me as we listen in to his testimony.
Hi, it's me, Samuel from Cairo, Egypt. I'm about to graduate from National Theological College and Graduate School. My minor is teaching. Actually, I enjoyed this journey of learning theology, Bible principles, and teaching techniques. What I learned helps me to teach Sunday school kids. From day one, I saw a difference in my life. and mindset. Now, I can see this positive change in my message and in the kids' life that I teach. Also, the lessons I learned helped me to write useful lessons for Sunday school teachers. By the way, I'm writing articles in one of the most famous websites for Sunday school teachers that helps him to learn well to teach their kids. I wanted to say thank you for all my teachers. Also, I wanted to say thank you for my brothers and sisters in Jesus' name who supported us to reach this stage.
If you'd like to learn how you can partner with the National Theological College and Graduate School in training students like Samuel in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Now back to our interview. Well, Dr. Adair, another urban legend that you address in your book is that pagan philosophy contaminated Christian theology. Please explain this misconception and begin to unravel this legend for us.
One of the things that really it's kind of a perspective that's come up in the last probably 200 or 300 years mostly. But the idea is that the church in its early stage was really a Jewish entity, and that over time it became increasingly burdened by the ideas of pagan philosophy. And what that means is that a lot of the doctrinal development that took place in the early church, where we have doctrines like the Trinity or Christology, we have particular language that the church begins to use, that Christians begin to use to describe who God is, that this language is actually, not only is it not helpful, it's actually harmful to the church, and it actually leads the church to deviate from the true faith and this sort of simple faith that was handed down by Jesus to a group of, fishermen, basically. That's the basic idea of the myth. What we write in the book and what we argue is that this is not actually true, which is not to say that Christians weren't interacting with pagan philosophy. They certainly were, and that starts very early. But what we also recognize in this myth, this pagan philosophy myth, is just the notion that people in the early church recognized that truth was located in many places. Obviously, from the apostles is key and at the core of who we are, but they would look around kind of like Paul did in Acts 17, and they would say, oh, look at this. Paul's quoting one of your poets, your pagan poets, to help make a point. And so they would use language sometimes to articulate points that they hoped would kind of make a connection. Pagan audience, right? We're talking to Gentiles. And so how do we talk to Gentiles? Well, we use language that they're familiar with. We use concepts that they're familiar with. It doesn't mean we're giving up the faith to do so. And what we find is, in terms of the legend, there are a number of people who just look back at Christianity, and this is really post-Reformation when this is happening. People like Michael Servetus, who famously was executed in Geneva, or Adolf von Harnack, who's a famous Protestant liberal theologian. These are people who would look back at the early church and say, yeah, the church was actually contaminated. And what we need to do is we need to get rid of all of this pagan philosophy stuff. And ultimately what that means is we're going to deny basic doctrines. We're going to deny the Trinity. We're going to deny Christology, that Jesus was divine. One of the more famous proponents of this that would be known to a lot of your listeners is a guy called Joseph Smith, who Mormonism believes that the church basically apostatized and it became overly philosophized, if you will, and all of these doctrines need to be rejected. So that's the basic legend.
Obviously, Paul and the apostles bridged the gaps between the truth and trying to teach. We think of the bema seat of Christ, right? The Gallio, was brought before Gallio, the bema of Gallio, and they're very familiar with that in Corinth, that there's a judgment seat. And so he builds on what they know to help them understand what they don't know about, and that is the judgment seat of Christ and this unknown God, all of these bridge building opportunities that Paul uses and the other apostles do as well, don't they?
You have to. There's no way to speak to a group of people without using language that they can understand and interacting at a conceptual level that they can understand. And our missionaries understand this very well, around the cake. They've got to frame things in certain ways. It's the same thing.
I think of the word logos. That's pretty significant, isn't it, in John's gospel as it relates to the word, this expression that they thought was in Greek philosophy was a message from the gods, would you say?
Yeah. Reason, order of the universe. Logos can mean so many different things. It was a great point of connection because who ordered the universe? Who is the force of reason and consistency and beauty and balance, Well, the triune God is the answer to this longing of the Greek philosophers. Part of it is apologetics, right? You can't communicate the gospel in a way people understand without using their language and imagery and analogies from their culture. So part of it's that as well.
Would you develop that a little further for us as far as a more precise understanding of the relationship of Greek culture and influence upon the writers of the New Testament and the early church fathers who used Greek expressions in their councils and their statements?
Yeah, so the New Testament, of course, are written in Greek. They picked Greek because it was the language that was going to get them as far as they wanted to go. I mean, as far as India and Spain, and I mean, it was the universal language at the time. So they're adopting these concepts, language, ways of kind of communicating things without giving up the truth, right? They're taking the truth and they're packaging it in a language that people can understand. And every generation is expected to do this, we ourselves. And so the church fathers, the early church understood, look, if we're going to explain what we mean by God's nature or who God is, compared to the pagan gods, or what we mean by the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, one God in three persons, and how do we understand this more precisely to avoid things like tritheism? Well, there's three gods, but they're all just one God with three different names. So they're having to explain and articulate that using the best language that they can at the time, which is the Greek language. So that's kind of what's going on. We're not capitulating. We're coming at it from the perspective of what is true biblical theology and how do we express this in terms that people understand.
I keep going back to John 1:1 because that seems to be such a perfect illustration where they understand Logos very different, but John is going to embed it with a better understanding of not only do we have revelation from God, we have the revealer himself.
Right, exactly.
Well, we're continuing our discussion of the first section in Dr. Svigel and Dr. Adair's book, Urban Legends of Church History. We're still discussing urban legends from the early years of the church. Another urban legend often repeated is that the doctrine of the Trinity developed centuries after Jesus. Dr. Svigel, please explain this legend and help to begin unraveling it.
Yeah, I think a lot of listeners will have experienced this where someone thinks that the doctrine of the Trinity was not held in the first couple of centuries, really until Nicaea decreed Jesus to be God, or Constantine forced that upon the church. This is another thing you see in the Da Vinci Code, another allegation. But you also hear it from, people knocking on your door Saturday afternoon. Certain groups, sects, various cults, heresies from the early church also taught that Jesus was a created being. He wasn't eternally God with the Father. And so this is the urban legends that has developed, that the doctrine of the Trinity didn't actually come into existence until well into the 3rd or 4th century.
So, Dr. Adair, in your chapter on this urban legend, you have a section entitled The Trinity Before Nicaea. Please explain the contents of that section.
Yeah, what we are arguing there, I think, is that you have really in the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, we're not developing the doctrine of the Trinity as if it wasn't there before. We prefer to use the language of there's development within the doctrine of the Trinity, meaning that Christians always affirmed it, even if they didn't have the specific language for it, right? And so we all know the word Trinity is not in the Bible. And
right.
That point gets made a lot.
I like to tell people the word Bible's not in the Bible, but we have this, it's a biblical concept, right? The collection of books is what we mean by Bible. So
you do believe in the Bible?
I definitely do, right? Okay. Even though the word Bible's not in the Bible, right?
Right.
Same with the Trinity.
Same with the Trinity, right? So always, as far as the Trinity goes, the idea that there's one God, the idea that there are three persons who are all divine and they're all equal and they're distinct from one another, those ideas have always been there. Those concepts have always been there. And so in that section, what we do is we include a whole host of quotes from the early church, 1st to 4th century. And walk through different Christians from different places all over the Christian world who are saying these kinds of things and showing us that the doctrine of Trinity was always present, even if they're not using that actual word.
And so it's more of a refinement of the language. So the concepts are there, but they're pretty plain assertions of Scripture. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. The Father's not the Son, the Son's not the Spirit, Spirit's not the Father, but there's just one God, not three gods. You can find Bible verses for all of those affirmations, but it's much more convenient to say one God in three persons or one nature in three persons. That kind of technical language is used to explain and articulate more clearly what we do and don't believe.
And many of those early church councils were to respond to heresies that were developing, like Arianism.
Yeah, that Jesus was a created being, which was, the church never taught that. And so they had to affirm that and then use technical language to rule out misunderstandings later. It's great language. It stood the test of time, but it's just reflecting what the Bible and what the early church has always taught. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. The Father's not the Son, the Son's not the Spirit's not the Father. There's just one God. I mean, that's the biblical data. That's what God has revealed. And then Nicaea kind of gives us technical language to describe that.
So recently, a couple episodes ago, we had Dr. Phil Carey on the program, and he discussed his recently released book titled The Nicene Creed, an Introduction. And he, develops that in much more length than we can at this point, but it's helpful to recognize that early church councils were in response to false teaching that was around, not because they're confirming new teaching. Is that right?
Right.
Exactly.
One of the things we do in the book, every chapter has a little application at the end. And one of the things I think is so important about this chapter and the application here is just, we don't believe in a generic, amorphous God, some kind of, first principle or something like this. We believe in a God who is Father, Son, and Spirit, a God who is triune.
Relational.
He's relational, and he works in this world in that way, right? All things come from God through the Son and by the power of the Spirit. And this is the framing for everything that happens with God in this world.
Well, our time is up for today's episode, but we only began our discussion. We only discussed the first section of Dr. Svigel and Dr. Adair's excellent book. In our next episode, we will continue our discussion about other urban legends from later church history. In the meantime, make sure that you jump online and order your own copy of Urban Legends of Church History, subtitled 40 Common Misconceptions, published by B&H Academic. Also, if you're enjoying the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, you may also enjoy our 6 to 10 minute faith-affirming findings videos. In these videos, I describe and show some of the most important discoveries from the field of biblical archaeology. They'll affirm your faith in the historicity of Scripture, provide unique insights into the background of the Bible. You can find them on our YouTube channel, which is also called Bible and Theology Matters. Please go to YouTube and in the search engine type Bible and Theology Matters, or go to our website and click on the YouTube link. Well, until next time, never forget, Bible and Theology Matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.